The obsidian blade trembled in the priest's hands as he carved the final glyph into bark paper, his eyes fixed on the harbor where floating mountains had appeared overnight, their white wings folded like sleeping birds. This is the story of how an empire that ruled 38 provinces and commanded tribute from millions fell not to superior numbers, but to a fracture that ran through its very heart, a crack that foreign steel would split wide open. In the spring of 1519, when Hernando Cortés landed near what would become Veracruz, with barely 500 soldiers, he stepped into a world where political alliances mattered more than gunpowder and where the choice between loyalty and survival would reshape an entire continent. The morning air along the coast carried the salt tang of the Gulf waters, mixed with the acrid smoke of copal incense burning in nearby temples. Fishermen, hauling in nets, paused to stare at the strange vessels riding the swells, their hulls dark against the pale dawn sky. From the beach, the ships looked like floating temples, complete with tall wooden towers that scraped the clouds. Runners had already departed for the imperial capital, their feet pounding the stone-paved roads that connected every corner of Moctezuma's realm. In Tenochtitlan, 250 miles inland, the emperor who ruled from his palace on Lake Texcoco would soon learn that the prophecies whispered in temple corridors were taking flesh and blood form on his distant shores. The strangers who waded through the surf that spring morning moved with the clanking rhythm of metal against metal. Their leader, a man the Nahua would come to know as Cortés, surveyed the coastline with calculating eyes, while his followers unloaded wooden tubes that thundered like captured lightning and four-legged beasts that snorted and stamped in the sand. 16 horses, more than most coastal villagers had ever imagined, could exist in the world. But what truly unsettled the watching natives was not the alien technology or the strange animals. It was the way these pale men moved through sacred spaces without hesitation, planting wooden crosses in soil where bloodied altars had stood for generations. They showed no recognition of the invisible boundaries that governed proper behavior, no acknowledgement of the spiritual protocols that kept the world in balance. Word traveled faster than the foreigners themselves. Long before Cortés could organize his small army for the march inland, Moctezuma's extensive network of tribute collectors, merchants, and diplomatic messengers had painted a detailed picture of the intruders. The emperor's response revealed both the sophistication of Aztec statecraft and its fatal blind spot. He chose to treat the arrival as a diplomatic challenge rather than a military threat. The gifts that arrived at the Spanish camp were masterpieces of imperial messaging, golden discs hammered thin as sunbeams, featherwork mosaics that shimmered with the captured light of tropical birds, and cotton mantles woven with threads that cost more than a commoner's yearly tribute. Each item carried layers of meaning designed to establish proper relationships between ruler and visitor, to channel the stranger's power into familiar patterns of exchange and obligation. Moctezuma's ambassadors approached with the measured steps of men performing a cosmic dance. They burned copal resin until sweet smoke wreathed the beach, offered carefully prepared foods, and spoke in the formal cadences reserved for addressing divine forces. Through interpreters, including a Nahua woman, the Spanish called Doña Marina, they conveyed their emperor's message, recognition of the stranger's power, generous tribute, and a firm invitation to accept these gifts and depart. But something was wrong with the ritual. The pale men seized the gold with obvious hunger, melted down the artistic masterpieces to test their purity, and showed little interest in the reciprocal obligations that should have bound them to Moctezuma's will. They wanted more gold, demanded guides inland, and spoke of their own emperor across the eastern waters who claimed dominion over lands he had never seen. The coastal peoples watched this diplomatic failure with growing unease. In the established order, tribute flowed upward to Tenochtitlan, while protection and legitimacy flowed downward to the provinces. But these strangers operated outside that system entirely. They offered alliance against the Aztec overlords, promised to break the tribute chains that bound local rulers, and demonstrated their power with displays that left no room for doubt. When Cortés ordered one of his small cannon fired into the forest, the thunderclap echoed across the water like the voice of Tlaloc himself. Trees splintered, birds exploded from their roosts in shrieking clouds, and the ground trembled underfoot. The watching Nahua had never seen destruction delivered from such distance, so suddenly, with such casual ease. As you listen to this account, imagine yourself standing on that beach in 1519, watching your world's fundamental assumptions crumble with each passing day. If you're finding this perspective on the Conquest compelling, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It helps more people discover these stories from the other side of history. Let me know in the comments what aspects of Aztec society you'd like to explore further. The Spanish captain had made his decision by the time Moctezuma's second embassy arrived with even more lavish gifts. Instead of accepting the tribute and sailing away as protocol demanded, Cortés ordered his ships burned on the beach, their wooden bones left to bleach in the tropical sun, while black smoke rose like a funeral pyre for any hope of retreat. Section 2. Blood and Bells. Church bells echoed across Cholula's courtyards in October 1519, while Spanish steel sliced through cotton armor and arquebus smoke drifted over 3,000 corpses that had been dancing just hours before. This massacre marked the moment when Nahua communities across central Mexico realized that traditional warfare, with its codes of capture over killing, its rituals of surrender and tribute, meant nothing to these foreign invaders. What happened in Cholula's sacred precincts would be whispered from village to village, reshaping how every altar petal calculated the cost of resistance versus collaboration. The march inland had begun, with Cortés following the ancient trade routes that connected the coast to the highland cities. His small army moved like a metal serpent through landscapes that had known only obsidian and bronze, their horses' hooves striking sparks from stone pavement laid down by generations of tribute labourers. Behind them, coastal caciques watched the dust clouds fade with a mixture of relief and dread, knowing they had cast their lots with forces they barely understood. The Spanish captain had learned quickly that Moctezuma's empire was less a unified state than a web of grudging tributaries held together by fear and mutual benefit. Every town they passed revealed new fractures in the imperial structure. Local rulers who paid their tribute but nursed decades-old grievances. Tribute collectors who lived behind fortified compounds because their presence sparked regular uprisings, and entire peoples like the Tlaxcalans who had never bent the knee to Tenochtitlan at all. It was in Tlaxcalan territory that Cortés first faced organized resistance from experienced Mesoamerican warriors. For 2 weeks in September, his army fought running battles against forces that understood every ridge and ravine, every seasonal stream and hidden path through the mountain forests. Tlaxcalan fighters struck like shadows, appearing from tree lines with atlatl darts whistling through the morning mist, then melting away before the Spanish cavalry could close the distance. The sound of war in those highland forests was unlike anything European ears had experienced. Instead of the crash of metal on metal familiar from old-world battlefields, combat here carried the sharp crack of obsidian blades shattering against steel, the wet thud of macuahutl clubs connecting with cotton armor, and the distinctive whistle of dart-throwing sticks cutting air. Spanish soldiers later described the eerie sensation of fighting enemies whose weapons made almost no noise until the moment they struck. Tlaxcalan warriors wore their battle scars like heraldry. Eagle knights painted their bodies with geometric patterns that told the story of previous campaigns, while jaguar societies covered themselves in spotted pelts and filed their teeth to points. They fought with a ferocity that impressed even the Spanish veterans, but their traditional tactics designed for capturing enemies alive for sacrifice proved less effective against opponents who showed no interest in taking prisoners. The turning point came when Tlaxcalan war chiefs realized that these strangers fought to kill, not to capture. Overnight, centuries of martial tradition had to be abandoned. Warriors who had spent years perfecting the techniques needed to subdue an opponent without fatal injury suddenly found themselves adapting to a style of warfare that treated human life as disposable. But the Tlaxcalans were pragmatists above all else. Once they understood that Cortés commanded genuine military power and harbored genuine hatred for their Aztec enemies, the calculation became simple. Here was an opportunity to settle scores that stretched back generations, to break tribute obligations that had bled their people dry, to reclaim territory lost in wars their grandfathers still remembered. The alliance forged in those September battles would prove decisive, though neither side fully understood its implications at the time. Cortés gained not just Tlaxcalan warriors, eventually tens of thousands of them, but access to their intelligence networks, their detailed knowledge of Aztec military capabilities, and their burning motivation to see Moctezuma's empire reduced to rubble. For the Tlaxcalans, the bargain seemed equally advantageous. They would march alongside these strange new allies, provide the numbers needed for major campaigns, and when the fighting ended, they would claim their reward in Aztec territory and treasure. What they could not foresee was how completely their world would be transformed by the forces they were helping to unleash. The march to Cholula proceeded through landscapes that seemed designed to humble any army, mountain passes where a handful of defenders could hold off thousands, river crossings where the current ran fast enough to sweep away men and horses, and always the thin air that left the Spanish gasping, while their native allies moved with casual efficiency through terrain that had shaped their ancestors for millennia. Cholula itself rose from the valley floor like a vision from another world. The Great Pyramid, larger at its base than anything in Egypt, dominated a city that served as both commercial hub and religious center for much of central Mexico. Pilgrims came from across the empire to worship at shrines that predated Aztec rule by centuries, while merchants gathered in markets where goods from both coasts changed hands according to price schedules more complex than anything found in European cities. The Cholulan elite received Cortés with the same diplomatic protocols Moctezuma had established: elaborate welcomes, generous gifts, and careful management designed to channel foreign power into familiar patterns. They offered the Spanish army quarters in compounds near the temple complex, provided food for both men and horses, and began the delicate process of determining what these strangers actually wanted. But something had shifted in the Spanish approach since the coast. Whether through genuine intelligence about a planned ambush or through calculated decision to terrorize potential opponents, Cortés moved beyond diplomacy to naked intimidation. On the morning designated for departure, he ordered his men to seal the exits from the main courtyard where Cholula's nobles had gathered for farewell ceremonies. The massacre that followed lasted only hours, but its psychological impact rippled across Mesoamerica for generations. Nahua witnesses described how the morning's religious dancing transformed into chaos as Spanish soldiers cut down unarmed celebrants who had expected nothing more threatening than ritual speeches and gift exchanges. Obsidian-tipped spears proved useless in the cramped courtyard against opponents in metal armor, while the sound of church bells rung by Spanish hands to coordinate the slaughter mixed with screams that could be heard across the valley. Picture yourself as a Cholulan merchant, watching from a nearby building as the plaza filled with smoke and the metallic scent of blood, knowing that everything your people had believed about proper conduct between civilized peoples was dying in that courtyard. 3,000 dead in a matter of hours, their blood seeping between the stones where incense had burned that very morning, and still the Spanish casualties numbered only a handful of wounded. Shell trumpets screamed across Lake Texcoco as Cortés stepped onto the Ixtapalapa causeway on November 8, 1519, while thousands of canoes formed escort formations in waters that reflected a city larger than any European capital. The Spanish entrada into Tenochtitlan represented more than a military occupation. It was the moment when two incompatible worldviews collided within the sacred heart of Mesoamerican civilization. What Moctezuma intended as controlled diplomatic theatre, a careful choreography of host and guest relationships that would contain foreign power within familiar rituals, instead became the final act of imperial miscalculation that would doom an empire. The causeway stretched ahead like a stone bridge to another world, raised several feet above the lake surface, and wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast. Spanish soldiers, their metal armor clattering with each step, found themselves funneled into a corridor where retreat would be impossible, and where every step forward committed them deeper into what could easily become a trap. The lake waters on either side teemed with canoes, some carrying curious spectators, others loaded with warriors whose intentions remained deliberately ambiguous. But it was the smell that struck the newcomers first. Lake Texcoco carried the mineral scent of alkali water, mixed with the green richness of Chinampa agriculture, the smoke of countless cooking fires, and underneath it all, the sweet, sharp tang of copal incense burning in temples whose scale defied European imagination. Spanish horses, already nervous from the unfamiliar terrain, shied and snorted at odors their instincts could not categorize. The skull racks flanking the causeway sent their own message. Thousands of human heads, cleaned and mounted on wooden frameworks, grinned down at the approaching army with empty sockets that seemed to track their movement. These tzompantli were not mere decorations but accounting systems, careful tallies of sacrificial offerings that maintained the cosmic balance between human society and divine forces. To Nahua observers, they represented order, prosperity, the proper functioning of the universe. To Spanish eyes, they promised the fate awaiting any who challenged the city's power. Sound layered upon sound as the procession advanced. The rhythmic splash of canoe paddles provided a liquid percussion beneath the deeper thunder of huetl drums, echoing from the twin temples that dominated Tenochtitlan's skyline. Shell trumpets technically sent haunting calls across the water, their notes designed to announce the arrival of significant personages and prepare the city for whatever ceremony was about to unfold. The city that revealed itself as they approached the central island exceeded even the most extravagant Spanish expectations. Streets ran straight as bowstrings between whitewashed buildings that rose 2 and 3 stories above carefully maintained canals. Bridges spanned the waterways at regular intervals, some fixed, others designed to be removed quickly in case of siege. Gardens cascaded from rooftops and terraces, creating hanging forests of flowers and food crops that softened the geometric precision of the urban plan. Canoe traffic moved through the canals with the organized efficiency of any major commercial center. Heavily loaded freight craft carried building stone and agricultural produce from the mainland, while smaller vessels darted between them like water bugs, their operators calling out news, prices, and gossip in voices that carried clearly across the water. The Spanish marveled at how the entire city seemed to float, supported by an aquatic infrastructure they barely understood. Moctezuma's reception party waited at the end of the causeway with all the ceremonial splendor an empire could muster. The emperor himself carried on a litter adorned with feathers worth more than most European nobles possessed in total wealth, descended to walk the final steps on bare earth, rather than risk spiritual contamination from direct contact with the strangers. His retinue moved with the measured grace of men performing a cosmic dance, each gesture calculated to demonstrate both imperial power and proper religious protocol. The meeting between Cortés and Moctezuma played out according to scripts neither man fully understood. The Spanish captain performed European courtesy, offering his hand and attempting to embrace the emperor as an equal. Moctezuma responded with Nahua diplomacy, accepting gifts but maintaining spiritual distance, speaking through intermediaries, including the woman the Spanish called Doña Marina, but whose Nahua name was Malintzin, a translator who would shape the conversation between civilizations. The lodging arrangements revealed how completely Moctezuma misread the situation. He housed the Spanish army in Axayacatl's palace, a complex that could accommodate hundreds of men while keeping them isolated from the general population. What he intended as honored hospitality, complete with food servers, incense bearers, and entertainers, the Spanish interpreted as convenient quarters for an occupying force. Within days, the subtle chemistry of host and guest relationships began to poison. Spanish soldiers explored their surroundings with the systematic thoroughness of men planning siege defenses. They noted the removable bridges, counted the guards, tested the walls for thickness, and calculated fields of fire from strategic positions. Their questions about gold deposits, tribute collection, and political alliances revealed interest that extended far beyond trade or even tribute. Moctezuma's court struggled to maintain normal routines, while hosting guests whose presence disrupted every established protocol. Daily ceremonies required modification when foreign observers showed no understanding of when to participate and when to remain silent. The emperor's meals, traditionally served by noble attendants according to complex hierarchies of status, became awkward performances, watched by men who showed no appreciation for the spiritual dimensions of royal sustenance. The breakthrough or breakdown came in late November, when Cortés abandoned any pretense of guest behavior and placed Moctezuma under house arrest. The mechanics of the seizure were almost anticlimactic. Spanish soldiers simply surrounded the emperor during what appeared to be a routine diplomatic meeting and informed him that he would thereafter reside in their quarters for his own protection. No violence was necessary. The mere threat of steel against the person of a ruler considered semi-divine was enough to paralyze the entire imperial system. What followed was a surreal period in which the Aztec Empire continued to function while its emperor lived as a prisoner in his own capital. Tribute continued to flow in from 38 provinces. Administrative decisions were made and executed. Religious ceremonies proceeded according to ancient schedules, but all under the supervision of a few hundred foreigners who understood almost nothing about the systems they now controlled. The psychological impact on the Nahua population was devastating. Their entire worldview rested on the assumption that proper relationships between human society and cosmic forces were maintained through imperial rituals performed by a legitimate ruler. Seeing Moctezuma reduced to a Spanish puppet, while the temples continued their daily sacrifices, created a cognitive dissonance that rippled through every level of society. Consider yourself a Tenochtitlan merchant, watching your emperor ask permission from foreigners before making pronouncements that had once carried the authority of the gods themselves. Yet beneath the surface compliance, resistance networks were already forming, planning for the day when the balance of power might shift enough to allow the city's true strength to manifest itself in ways these strange guests had yet to imagine. Shell ankle bells jingled in perfect rhythm as Nahua dancers circled the temple courtyard in May 1520. their bodies painted with sacred designs, unaware that Spanish soldiers were already barring the exits behind them. The Tenochtitlan massacre would shatter the last illusions about coexistence between Aztec and Spanish civilizations. What began as the empire's most sacred festival, a celebration designed to ensure the sun's continued journey across the heavens, ended with a courtyard running red and a city-wide uprising that would burn for months. This moment marked the irreversible transition from uneasy occupation to total war. The festival preparations had begun weeks earlier, even as tensions simmered beneath Tenochtitlan's surface calm. Priests worked through the pre-dawn hours, grinding pigments for body paint, while artisans shaped the ritual implements needed for ceremonies that connected human society to cosmic forces. The Great Teocalli Pyramid received fresh coats of lime plaster until its steps gleamed white against the morning sky, and massive braziers were loaded with copal resin that would burn continuously throughout the celebrations. Spanish soldiers watched these preparations with growing unease. The scale of the gathering, the obvious military precision of the organizing, and the fact that thousands of warriors were converging on the temple complex from across the empire suggested something more threatening than religious observance. Pedro de Alvarado, left in command while Cortés marched to the coast to deal with a rival Spanish expedition, saw conspiracy in every ritual gesture. The sound of preparation filled the city for days. Craftsmen hammered metal ornaments for ceremonial dress, while drummers practiced complex rhythms that would coordinate the dancing. Women ground maize for the feast foods that would sustain celebrants through days of ceremony, their metates scraping in rhythm with the temple activities. Children learned the songs that would accompany processions, their voices carrying across the lake in harmonies that had been perfected over generations. The festival itself began before dawn on the appointed day, with conch shells calling across the water to announce the sun's emergence from the underworld. Dancers assembled in the main courtyard wearing costumes that transformed them into living representations of natural forces, some as jaguars with spotted pelts, others as eagles with feathered wings, still others as flowering plants that connected earth to sky. Their movements followed patterns laid down in the creation stories, each step and gesture designed to maintain the cosmic balance that kept the world functioning. What the dancers could not see was the trap closing around them. Spanish soldiers had positioned themselves at every exit from the courtyard, their swords already drawn, their crossbows loaded and aimed. Alvarado had convinced himself or convinced his men that the festival was cover for a coordinated attack on the Spanish garrison. Whether this fear was genuine or manufactured, the result was the same. European panic meeting Mesoamerican religious ecstasy in the most violent possible collision. The signal came just as the dancing reached its crescendo. Spanish steel flashed in the morning sunlight as soldiers rushed into the courtyard, cutting down celebrants who had no weapons beyond ceremonial knives and no protection beyond cotton garments and faith. The shell bells that had marked perfect rhythm now scattered across stones slick with blood, their music replaced by screams that could be heard across the lake. Nahua sources later described how the courtyard ran like water with blood, how dancers tried to climb the walls only to be pulled down and butchered, how the very ground seemed to drink the offerings of human life that had been intended for the gods. Bodies piled against the sealed exits as hundreds of people pressed forward in desperate attempts to escape, while Spanish soldiers worked with methodical efficiency to ensure no witnesses survived. The massacre lasted only minutes, but its psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. The sacred heart of the empire had been violated during its holiest celebration, the connection between human society and divine forces severed by foreign steel. Runners carried the news to every quarter of the city within hours, and by afternoon the uprising had begun. What erupted across Tenochtitlan was not the organized military response the Spanish had feared, but something far more dangerous. Popular fury unleashed without central coordination. Citizens poured from their homes carrying whatever weapons they could find: kitchen knives, farming tools, ceremonial clubs, pieces of broken obsidian. They moved through the streets like floodwater, overwhelming Spanish patrols that had been prepared for conventional warfare, but not for an entire city's population turned hostile. The Spanish garrison found themselves trapped in Axayacatl's palace, surrounded by enemies who knew every alley and rooftop, every canal crossing and hidden passage. Slings hurled clay bullets that cracked against stone walls, while atlatl darts punched through Spanish cotton armor with surprising effectiveness. The obsidian-edged macuahuitl clubs that had seemed primitive curiosities now revealed their true purpose as they shattered against steel weapons, their stone blades sharp enough to slice through anything softer than metal. Moctezuma, still held in Spanish custody, became a tragic figure caught between irreconcilable forces. His captors demanded that he appear before his people and restore order, while his subjects saw in him either a collaborator who had betrayed them to foreigners or a victim whose powerlessness revealed the complete breakdown of traditional authority. When he was finally brought to a palace balcony to address the crowd, the response was immediate and decisive. Stones and darts flew from the mob below, striking down the man who had once been considered the living representative of divine power. Whether Moctezuma died from these wounds or was killed by Spanish hands remains a matter historians debate, but the symbolic impact was clear. The last link between the old order and the new had been severed, leaving both sides to face a future that neither had wanted but both had made inevitable. Then, as if the gods themselves were taking sides, smallpox arrived with a soldier from Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition. Within weeks, pustules and fever were spreading through the lake communities, killing with an efficiency that made European weapons seem almost merciful by comparison. Picture yourself as a survivor in those plague-ravaged streets, watching your city transform into a charnel house while foreign invaders huddled behind stone walls, waiting for disease to accomplish what their swords had begun. The Spanish position had become untenable, but escape across the causeways would require abandoning the gold they had accumulated and fighting their way through a population that now saw them as enemies of both human society and cosmic order. Rain drummed against the palace walls as Spanish soldiers counted their dead by candlelight on June 30th, 1520, while outside the city howled for their blood and the lake waters rose with the summer storms. The Night of Sorrows would prove that all the steel in Christendom meant nothing when an entire civilization turned against you. What began as a calculated retreat under cover of darkness became a rout that left the causeways choked with corpses and the lake bottom carpeted with Spanish gold. This single night would demonstrate the true power of Tenochtitlan's aquatic defences and show how quickly European technological advantages could evaporate in the face of local knowledge and popular fury. The Spanish garrison had been trapped in Axayacatl's palace for weeks, their situation growing more desperate with each passing day. Food supplies dwindled as the city's normal commerce shut down around them. The stench of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and overflowing latrines filled rooms that had once hosted imperial banquets. Spanish soldiers, accustomed to campaigning in the open field, found themselves reduced to the status of besieged rats, jumping at every sound that might signal the next assault. Outside the palace walls, Tenochtitlan had transformed into a maze of makeshift fortifications and killing zones. Citizens torn up paving stones to build barricades, while craftsmen worked around the clock forging new weapons from whatever metal they could scavenge. The rhythmic pounding of hammers on bronze echoed through neighborhoods where children once played as the city's entire population mobilized for what everyone understood would be a fight to the death. The decision to attempt escape came when Cortés realized that their position was not just hopeless, but actively deteriorating. Every day brought new reports of Spanish outposts falling throughout the empire, of native allies switching sides, of supply lines cut and reinforcements scattered. The treasure they had accumulated, rooms full of golden artifacts melted down into portable bars, had become more burden than asset, its weight slowing movement while its presence advertised their location to every enemy scout. The escape plan revealed how little the Spanish understood about Tenochtitlan's defensive advantages. The route they chose westward across the Tlacopan Causeway seemed the most direct path to the mainland, but it also led through the heart of the lake system, where Nahua naval power could be brought to bear most effectively. The removable bridges that had seemed like curious architectural features during their triumphant entry now revealed their true purpose as death traps for any force attempting to retreat. Preparation for the breakout proceeded in whispers and shadows. Spanish soldiers selected only the most essential equipment, abandoning the heavy armor that had protected them in European battles but proved unwieldy in Mesoamerican conditions. They fashioned rough wooden bridges from palace furniture, hoping these makeshift spans could carry them across the gaps where stone bridges had been removed. The gold tons of it was distributed among the men despite warnings that its weight would prove fatal if they ended up in the water. The rain that began falling that afternoon was both blessing and curse. It provided cover for their movements while turning the causeway stones slick and treacherous. The storm clouds that gathered over Lake Texcoco matched the mood of men who understood they were probably marching to their deaths but saw no alternative except certain destruction if they remained. As midnight approached, the palace gates opened for the last time. Spanish soldiers and their Tlaxcalan allies filed into the streets in as much silence as armor and weapons permitted, their footsteps muffled by the rain but still audible to anyone listening for exactly this sort of movement. Behind them, the rooms where they had lived for months as unwelcome guests stood empty, except for the treasure they could not carry and the wounded they could not save. The early stages of the retreat proceeded almost smoothly. The first sections of the causeway were intact, allowing the column to move at decent speed despite the darkness and rain. Spanish soldiers found themselves thinking that perhaps their luck had finally turned, that they might reach the mainland before the city's defenders realized what was happening. The weight of gold in their packs felt less burdensome when escape seemed possible. But Tenochtitlan's intelligence network had detected their movement within minutes of departure. Conch shells began sounding across the lake, their mournful calls coordinating a response that had been planned for exactly this contingency. Canoe squadrons pushed off from hidden inlets, their hulls loaded with warriors who knew every current and shallow in waters that had been their highway since childhood. The trap was sprung at the first major gap in the causeway, where the Spanish makeshift bridges proved inadequate for the loads they had to bear. The wooden spans, hastily constructed from palace furniture, sagged and cracked under the weight of men in armor carrying additional burdens of gold and weapons. What should have been a quick crossing became a bottleneck, where the entire retreat ground to a halt. That was when the canoe attack began. Nahua warriors emerged from the rain and darkness like water spirits, their craft appearing alongside the causeway so suddenly that Spanish soldiers had no time to form defensive lines. Atlatl darts whistled through the night air, finding gaps in armor with deadly accuracy, while slingers sent clay bullets cracking against helmets with sounds like breaking pottery. The causeway became a slaughter ground measured in yards. Spanish soldiers, weighed down by gold and unable to maneuver effectively on the narrow stone roadway, found themselves easy targets for enemies who could strike from the water and disappear before retaliation was possible. The rain that had promised concealment now worked against them, making footing treacherous and vision nearly impossible. Picture yourself pressed into that desperate column, feeling the causeway shake under artillery wheels while death calls from the darkness on both sides, knowing that every step forward might be your last. When the first bridge collapsed completely, dumping soldiers and treasure into the lake, the retreat transformed into pure chaos as men faced the choice between drowning with their gold or abandoning their fortune to save their lives. The screaming started when the makeshift bridges gave way completely, dumping armored men into black water that swallowed their cries along with Spanish gold worth a king's ransom. The collapse of the Night of Sorrows retreat proved that Lake Texcoco itself was Tenochtitlan's greatest defender. What had seemed like an escape route to desperate Spanish soldiers became a killing ground where European military advantages meant nothing and where local knowledge of currents, depths, and seasonal variations determined who lived and who fed the lake bottom. This disaster would reshape the entire conflict, stripping away Spanish illusions of invincibility while teaching the Nahua that these foreign invaders could be defeated. The water around the broken causeway turned into a chaos of thrashing bodies, floating debris, and spreading blood that looked black in the moonlight. Spanish soldiers who had survived battles from Italy to the Caribbean found themselves drowning in armor designed for European battlefields. Their steel protection transformed into death weights that dragged them beneath the surface before they could shed their burdens. Nahua canoe crews worked the dark waters like hunters, their paddles cutting silently through the carnage as they finished off survivors and salvaged whatever weapons and equipment they could recover. The obsidian-tipped war clubs that had seemed so primitive when compared to Spanish steel now proved their effectiveness in close quarters, splitting skulls and crushing ribs with efficiency born of generations of practice. But it was the gold that created the most lasting image of that terrible night. Bars of precious metal, melted down from artistic masterpieces that had taken lifetimes to create, sank through the lake water like stones while desperate men chose between wealth and breath. Spanish soldiers who had imagined themselves returning to Extremadura as rich conquistadors instead found themselves clawing at their own pack straps, trying to shed the fortune that was pulling them to their deaths. The sound of that disaster echoed across the lake for hours, the splash of bodies hitting water, the crack of wooden debris against stone, the gurgling cries of men who had forgotten how to swim under the weight of armor and avarice. Nahua witnesses later described how the water itself seemed to turn solid, so thick was it with corpses and abandoned equipment. Those Spanish who managed to reach the mainland did so stripped of everything but their lives. Cortés himself arrived on the western shore with a head wound and the bitter knowledge that his great adventure had become a catastrophe. Behind him, the causeway told the story in debris and bloodstains, broken weapons, torn banners, and enough European corpses to feed the lake's fish for months. The Spanish survivors who stumbled into the forests beyond Tlacopan bore little resemblance to the confident army that had entered Tenochtitlan 7 months earlier. Their armor was dented and rust-stained, their weapons notched and dulled, their faces marked by the hollow-eyed look of men who had seen their world collapse in a single night. Many carried wounds that would never fully heal, while others had lost fingers, hands, or eyes to Nahua weapons, designed to maim rather than kill cleanly. But the psychological wounds cut deeper than any obsidian blade. These men had believed in their technological superiority, their divine mission, their inevitable victory over primitive heathens. Now they understood that their survival depended on the tolerance of peoples they had dismissed as inferior, and that all their steel and gunpowder meant nothing when turned against enemies who fought on their own ground according to their own rules. Word of the Spanish defeat spread across central Mexico, faster than the survivors themselves could travel. From village to village, market to market, temple to temple, the news carried the same electrifying message. The foreign invaders were not gods, not invincible, not destined to rule over the people of the Sunday. They bled when cut, drowned when weighted with gold, and ran screaming when their plans collapsed around them. The impact on Spanish native allies was immediate and devastating. Communities that had declared for Cortés began hedging their bets, sending secret embassies to Tenochtitlan while maintaining public neutrality. Tribute that had been promised to the Spanish cause mysteriously disappeared, while guides who had been eager to serve the winning side suddenly developed convenient memory problems about routes and resources. In Tenochtitlan itself, the victory celebration lasted for days. Warriors displayed Spanish weapons captured from the causeway, while priests offered thanksgiving ceremonies for divine favor that had delivered enemies into the hands of the faithful. The skull racks that had once impressed Spanish soldiers with their grim efficiency now received new additions. The European heads that stared out over the lake with empty sockets that reflected the moonlight. Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's brother, assumed the throne with a legitimacy that his predecessor had lost through collaboration with foreign invaders. His first acts as Tlatoani revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the position he had inherited. The empire's administrative machinery continued to function, tribute flowed, markets operated, religious ceremonies proceeded according to ancient schedules, but the psychological damage of the occupation could not be quickly repaired. The new emperor's most urgent challenge was not Spanish military power, which had been temporarily neutralized, but the invisible enemy that traveled with European soldiers and spread through native populations without regard for political boundaries or military strategies. Smallpox had arrived in the company of Narvaez's men, and by the winter of 1520, it was moving through the lake communities with the efficiency that made European weapons seem almost merciful. The disease struck with particular cruelty at the leadership classes who had maintained closest contact with Spanish occupiers, nobles who had served as intermediaries, priests who had observed foreign religious practices, merchants who had traded with European suppliers all found themselves among the first victims of an epidemic that recognized no rank or privilege. Picture yourself as a Nahua noble watching pustules spread across your children's faces while European survivors huddle in distant camps, planning their return with allies whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of revenge and plunder. Yet even as smallpox ravaged the city's population, Cuauhtémoc was already planning defenses against the Spanish return that everyone knew was inevitable. The sound of hammers on wood echoed across Lake Texcoco in April 1521 as 13 European warships slid into waters that had never known sails, their cannon muzzles glinting like the eyes of metal serpents. The construction and launch of Cortés's brigantine fleet represented the moment when European naval technology met Mesoamerican aquatic warfare in a contest that would determine the fate of an empire. These ships, built in sections far from the lake and carried overland through mountain passes, gave the Spanish the one advantage they had lacked during their first disastrous occupation: control of the water highways that were Tenochtitlan's lifeline. Young Cuauhtémoc, perhaps 25 years old and bearing the weight of an empire on his shoulders, had spent the winter months since Cuitlahuac's death transforming his island capital into the most formidable fortress in the Americas. Where Moctezuma had relied on diplomacy and Cuitlahuac had trusted in popular uprising, the new Tlatoani understood that survival required systematic military preparation on a scale that would test every resource his people possessed. The sound of reconstruction filled the city through the short winter days. Stonemasons repaired the causeways damaged during the Spanish retreat, their chisels ringing against horizontal blocks quarried from the mainland and ferried across waters that shimmered with morning mist. engineers reinforced the removable bridges, adding new mechanisms that could drop sections of roadway into the lake within minutes of receiving warning signals. Carpenters built additional war canoes, their adzes shaping hulls from cedar logs that arrived as tribute from mountain provinces. But the most crucial work happened in the workshops where bronze bells were cast and weapons repaired. Nahua metallurgists, working with techniques that predated European contact by centuries, melted down ceremonial objects to create spear points and dart tips. The rhythmic hammering of metal on metal provided a percussion backdrop to the city's daily life, while apprentices worked bellows that kept forges glowing red through the night hours. The Spanish return had been inevitable, but the form it took caught even Cuauhtémoc's scouts by surprise. Intelligence reports from the mainland described an extraordinary engineering project, European shipwrights constructing ocean-going vessels in the mountains, far from any navigable water. The scale of the undertaking suggested either madness or a strategic vision that transcended conventional military thinking. Texcoco, the lake's eastern shore city, whose allegiance had shifted decisively to the Spanish cause, became the staging ground for an operation that would reshape the geography of warfare in central Mexico. Thousands of indigenous laborers, supervised by Spanish carpenters who had never imagined building ships in a landlocked valley, assembled prefabricated sections that had been carried piece by piece through mountain passes that barely accommodated mule trains. The ships themselves were unlike anything Lake Texcoco had ever supported. Designed for ocean warfare but adapted for shallow water operations, they carried small cannon that could sink any canoe with a single shot, while their sails allowed them to move independent of wind direction in ways that paddle-powered craft could never match. Most importantly, they drew little enough water to navigate the lake's shallowest channels, areas where Nahua captains had always been able to retreat when pressed by superior forces. When the brigantines launched in April, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Nahua observers watching from Tenochtitlan's shore saw floating fortresses that violated every assumption about what was possible on their inland sea. These ships moved against the wind, turned without regard for current, and carried firepower that could reach any point on the lake's perimeter. Suddenly, the water highways that had always been Tenochtitlan's greatest defensive advantage became vulnerable to enemies who understood naval warfare from a completely different tradition. Cuauhtémoc's response revealed both his tactical intelligence and the limitations imposed by fighting with Bronze Age technology against Iron Age opponents. He mobilized every canoe squadron in the lake system, creating a fleet that numbered in the thousands, but whose individual vessels could barely survive a single cannon shot. His strategy relied on overwhelming the Spanish ships with sheer numbers, accepting horrific casualties in exchange for the possibility of boarding and capturing the brigantines through hand-to-hand combat. The first naval engagements played out like contests between schools of fish and hunting sharks. Nahua canoe swarms would appear from hidden inlets, their crews paddling with desperate intensity toward the Spanish ships, only to be scattered by cannon fire that turned wooden hulls into clouds of splinters and killed rowers by the dozen. Yet some craft always broke through the defensive fire, their crews leaping aboard the brigantines with obsidian-edged clubs and bronze-tipped spears, fighting with a ferocity that impressed even veteran Spanish sailors. But the mathematics of the contest were inexorable. Every Spanish ship destroyed could be replaced from European resources, while every Nahua canoe lost represented irreplaceable skilled craftsmen and experienced warriors. The lake that had once protected Tenochtitlan was becoming a killing ground, where Spanish technological advantages multiplied with each engagement. By May, the siege had begun in earnest. 3 Spanish columns advanced along the major causeways Ixtapalapa, Tlacopan, and Tepeyac, lifting the removable bridges every night to prevent surprise attacks, while the brigantine fleet prowled the lake channels, intercepting supply canoes and cutting the water routes that had sustained the city for generations. The systematic destruction that followed would be remembered in Nahua oral tradition as the eating of the houses. Spanish engineers, applying lessons learned from European siege warfare, advanced through the city by knocking holes through interior walls, avoiding the street-level kill zones where obsidian-edged weapons could be most effective. Building by building, block by block, they reduced Tenochtitlan's architectural marvels to rubble that could be used to fill the canals and create solid ground for cavalry operations. Picture yourself standing on a temple pyramid, watching smoke rise from districts where your grandparents had lived, knowing that each plume marks another neighborhood falling to enemies who fight by destroying rather than conquering. The freshwater aqueducts from Chapultepec had been cut within the first week, forcing the city's defenders to choose between surrender and a siege that would test human endurance against the grinding certainty of Spanish engineering. The grinding of metates echoed through Tlatelolco's empty market at dawn on August 13, 1521, as the last women in Tenochtitlan sang war songs loud enough to drown out musket fire until the stone songs stopped, and with them, the final heartbeat of an empire. The 75-day siege that destroyed Tenochtitlan became a contest between Spanish engineering and Nahua endurance, between European siegecraft and Mesoamerican urban warfare, between the grinding certainty of blockade and the desperate creativity of a people fighting for their civilization's survival. What emerged from that crucible was not victory or defeat in any conventional sense, but the birth of a new world built on the bones of the old. The smell of hunger had settled over the city like morning mist by July, clinging to every surface and penetrating every building. In neighborhoods where the aroma of chocolate and roasting chilies had once drifted from noble kitchens, the air now carried the sharper sense of desperation, boiled leather, charred reed mats, and the green algae scraped from canal stones that had become a delicacy worth fighting over. Cuauhtémoc's defenders had learned to fight a different kind of war than their ancestors had ever imagined. Traditional Mesoamerican combat, with its emphasis on capturing enemies for sacrifice and its seasonal patterns that allowed for planting and harvest, had given way to something that resembled the grinding sieges of European military tradition. Warriors who had once competed for honor in ritual combat now spent their days moving through mouse holes knocked between buildings, emerging from unexpected angles to strike at Spanish engineers before melting back into the urban maze. The systematic destruction of the city proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Spanish columns advanced by reducing buildings to rubble, filling canals with stone and timber, creating solid ground where cavalry could operate effectively. The architectural marvels that had impressed Cortés during his first entry, the straight streets, the geometric precision, the integration of water and stone disappeared under a blanket of debris that would reshape the very geography of the lake. But it was in Tlatelolco's great market that the siege reached its symbolic climax. The plaza, where 25,000 traders had once gathered daily to exchange goods from across Mesoamerica, became a killing ground where the last organized resistance made its stand. Piles of maize sacks, once symbols of abundance and commercial prosperity, burned like funeral pyres, while Spanish artillery turned market stalls into splintered wood and the distinctive stench of gunpowder mixed with rotting food carried across the water for days. The children suffered most visibly. Boys who should have been learning warrior skills in the Tenochtitlan schools instead carried water jars through sniper zones, dodging crossbow bolts while delivering the brackish lake water that had replaced the sweet flow from Chapultepec's aqueducts. Girls ground the last kernels of maize on metates, while their mothers' hands bled from working stone querns that had worn smooth from months of desperate use. Prices in the remaining markets reflected the mathematical progression of siege warfare. A single tortilla, worth perhaps one cacao bean in normal times, commanded 5 or 10 beans as starvation tightened its grip. Dogs and rats, once considered fit only for slaves, became delicacies that noble families fought over with an intensity that would have been unthinkable before the foreign ships appeared on their lake. The priests maintained their ritual obligations even as the city crumbled around them. On temple steps slick with morning dew and human blood, they burned what copal they could find while painting their bodies with hematite and smearing their lips with maguey sap. Their chants promised that the sun would continue its journey across the heavens as long as hearts still beat in human chests, but fewer voices joined the dawn chorus each day. Spanish tactical innovation adapted to urban warfare with the same systematic approach that had built the brigantine fleet. Soldiers learned to use war dogs in the narrow spaces between buildings, while cavalry found ways to operate on rooftops and in courtyards where their mobility advantages could be preserved. The crossbow volleys that had proven so effective in open battle gave way to close-quarters fighting, where Spanish steel met Nahua obsidian in contests measured in inches rather than yards. Yet the defenders' knowledge of their urban environment continued to exact a price from the invaders. Cuauhtémoc's scouts had mapped every Spanish routine, noting where horses balked at staircases too steep for hooves, where crossbow ranges fell short of their targets, where the peculiar acoustics of canal-side fighting could mask the approach of war parties until the last moment. Boys with reed whistles relayed timing signals across rooftops, coordinating attacks that struck just as Spanish sentries changed shifts or artillery crews paused to reload. The war canoes that had once dominated the lake's open waters learned to fight in the canal networks, where Spanish sails provided less advantage and deeper drafts became liabilities. Nahua crews developed tactics for combat in spaces too narrow for brigantines to maneuver effectively, using fire rafts and ramming attacks in desperate attempts to neutralize the floating fortresses that had cut their city off from the world. One engagement that passed into both Spanish and Nahua military legend involved a challenge to single combat issued during a temporary ceasefire. A Mexican herald, standing at the edge of a canal, shouted across the water, offering to meet any Spanish champion on the floating stone, a reference to the neutral ground where such contests had traditionally been settled. Both armies watched as a Jaguar knight faced an armored conquistador in a duel that ended with the Nahua warrior dragging his opponent into the water, where steel armor proved more hindrance than help. By August, the mathematics of siege warfare had reached their inevitable conclusion. Disease had reduced both sides' effective strength, but Spanish supply lines remained intact while Tenochtitlan's population faced the choice between surrender and death from starvation. Floating corpses fouled the canals until the lake took on a greasy sheen from decomposing human fat, while burial teams worked from dusk to dawn, stacking bodies 3 and 4 high along what remained of the canal edges. Cuauhtémoc's final gambit, a breakout attempt across the northern causeways, with thousands of followers played into Spanish naval superiority. The brigantine fleet herded the escaping canoes into killing zones, where grapeshot could shred wooden hulls, and Spanish marines could board any craft that survived the initial bombardment. The young emperor's capture by Garcia Holguin's crew marked the end of organized resistance, though scattered fighting would continue for days. Picture yourself standing in Tlatelolco's ruined market on that August morning, watching Spanish soldiers plant crosses where skull racks had cast their shadows, knowing that the world of your ancestors had died with the last drumbeat from the shattered temples. The casualty estimates that filtered back to Spain spoke of tens of thousands dead in Tenochtitlan alone, though Nahua sources used words like countless to describe losses that defied traditional accounting systems. What could be counted was the transformation of a city that had amazed European visitors into a landscape of rubble and ash, where church bells would soon replace the slit drum rhythms that had once measured the heartbeat of Mesoamerican civilization. Within months, Spanish architects would trace a new grid over the sacred precinct, canals would be filled to create European-style streets, and markets would rise where temples had anchored the connection between human society and cosmic forces. Yet in villages throughout central Mexico, cantares would preserve the memory of Cicoatl, one serpent, the day when the sun was hot but the water was cold, and an empire learned that even stone could weep.